There are plenty of opinions to be had about what happened to Halo. It's not hard to find people blaming this or that for the downfall of the series over the last decade, or even those who argue that things are better than ever, seemingly blind to the overwhelming consensus from fans that things have indeed gotten worse. Today I wanted to discuss what I believe happened to Halo, because I think it sort of unifies a lot of the other points that people are making, and with Infinite on the horizon, and the signs that things are in fact getting better, such as the art style, I wanted to throw my voice into the fray in hopes that perhaps it will resonate with whoever sees this video. And whenever the flighting program starts, that this outlook may help people understand what, if anything, feels off. First of all, I don't want you to get the impression that I'm going to spend this entire video ranting about one single thing that damaged Halo's brand, because there's a lot more to it. But one thing I will bring up a lot is simplicity. Halo was built on a very simple sandbox formula, and so much of its essence, its very identity, stems from it being relatively easy to approach. Of course, things got more detailed as new games came out, but the original Bungie games, as they are now known, that simplicity was never fundamentally changed. The art style, especially in the first few games, was fairly clean, almost cartoonish. I know some people hate describing it that way because Halo is a military shooter, but it is. It's got a very distinct and colorful art style that isn't tremendously realistic. Even Reach maintained a relatively simple art style, despite taking on a grittier appearance than previous titles. Reach is where a lot of people say that Halo started the downward decline, and I can see why. You can sort of start to see the chinks in Halo's armor. There was the art style, which Reach had a decent departure from the classic art style. The base game mechanics, you had the golden triangle, a weapon, grenade, melee, and now they're throwing armor abilities into the mix, so that starts to conflict with our once simple formula. But there were always elements in previous games as well, like power-ups, equipment, but Reach took a big risk with armor abilities by essentially giving you perma equipment that you could use at nearly any time you wanted, reliably. Again, the things that Reach experimented with are where you start to see things that I believe led to where we are now. And I want to state as well that I don't think Bungie intentionally set things up this way. I don't believe they were trying to set up any of their successors' games for failure. Most people know Bungie was sick of Halo by the time they left Microsoft. They wanted to move on and do something new. Reach wasn't even supposed to be their last game initially. After Halo 3, they were contracted to produce 2 more full-price Halo games, and they sort of beefed out ODST as a standalone title rather than the expansion it was going to be initially. Reach was a Halo game made by people who were tired of making Halo games. And maybe that's not entirely fair to say. Not everyone who worked on Reach even stayed at Bungie. Some people jumped over to 343 as soon as Bungie left. But I think that the general feeling that Bungie had with Reach was, okay, this is our swan song. We're tired of doing this, but we'll do our best and experiment with some things along the way and leave our baby as strong as we can. The problem is that those experiments weren't really learned from. Halo 4 feels, in a lot of ways, like just a modded version of Reach, but I'll get into that in a minute. What I'm really trying to get at here is that Halo was a very iterative game until 2012. Every game had a set of things you expected from it, and every release added something to that list, and rarely was anything removed. Sometimes things would get retooled, but it wouldn't really get taken away. If you had something in the previous game, you could pretty well expect that it would come back. Like I said, the games were iterative. For instance, custom games. Being able to play a multiplayer game with your friends, fight each other, capture the flag. That was in Halo 1. And in Halo 2, it got an upgrade. They added more game modes, they added more options to customize, have player movement, what you'll spawn with, everything like that. Halo 3, same thing. They added Forge to even complement that. And Reach, again, more options, more freedom for creativity in how you play the game. Halo was always progressing, and the consumers could count on the next product improving on the one that released previously. And I believe that Bungie never failed with that. But when 343 took over, it was a whole new ballgame. 343 was a new and inexperienced studio comprised of people who came from all types of different projects. Frank O'Connor, the current franchise development director at 343, and one of the guys who jumped ship from Bungie during the transition, he was quoted back when Halo 4 first released as have said this. We had people who we hired who hated Halo because of X. But what that really means was, we feel like this game could be awesome because of Y. They had a lot of people who wanted to change the core of the game because it didn't align with their personal preference, and there's nothing wrong with that inherently. I can't blame someone for wanting to make something better, as far as they can tell, in their own eyes. But when that sort of attitude is taken in so many different aspects of the game, the gameplay, the story, the art style, it hardly resembles the entity that preceded it. People often criticize 343 for selfishly wanting to put their own spin on Halo. But I think they miss the fact that this wasn't all necessarily premeditated just to conform to current trends, or out of some malicious intent, as some even imply it. It was a bunch of groups of people who wanted to make something they enjoyed. The problem is that it left a lot of things feeling disjointed. Not just from the games that came before, but even within the game itself. When Halo 4 came out, it was the first time Halo took a step backwards. It became regressive. And there are a lot of things to point at in order to argue for this regression, and most of them have been talked about to death, so I'll try to keep my list as short as I can, while still getting the point across. Custom games was missing vital modes in customization in Halo 4 that had been in several games previous. Race, Infection, Territories, Juggernaut, Headhunter. Some of these were not only hugely popular, but were the base for other extremely popular community-made game types that could no longer be made. You might be thinking, hold on, Halo 4 did have Infection, but no, it had Flood Mode. And Flood Mode didn't allow you to change so many different things about the infected players and what their weapons and appearance would be. And a lot of those classic custom games, like Speed Halo, Cops and Robbers, Fat Kid, couldn't be made anymore. They couldn't even be kind of poorly made. They just couldn't be made. Sort of compounding that issue that custom games suffered in Halo 4, the Forge mode was definitely not an improvement. In most ways, it felt identical to Halo Reach, which isn't a bad thing because Reach had a good Forge mode, but it was missing a lot of things too. Precision editing, for example, the ability to sort of slow everything down and move everything really slow so you could get the right piece in the right place really precisely. That was just gone entirely. And that made things like building racetracks, even though you couldn't play race, it pretty much not impossible, but a lot harder than it needed to be at the time. And the things that were added, like the dynamic lighting or more in-depth coloring of objects, didn't really justify the removal of other things. Another big step back with Forge mode was that we didn't really have a Forge space anymore. The 3 Forge canvases that were launched with Halo 4 were severely limited in their design as far as what they would allow you to build, and none of them were remotely close to the size of Forge World. So you were significantly limited in the size of the map that you could build relative to what Halo Reach had to offer. And while I did somewhat rectify this with Forge Island, I would hardly call Forge Island a replacement for Forge World. Side note, the Forge mode for Halo 4 wasn't actually developed by 343, so they're not entirely to blame. It was actually developed by Certain Affinity, who've helped a lot with Halo projects in the past, so it makes sense why that Forge mode felt so similar to the one that came before it. It was essentially just a port. Now, Firefight, which was still, just like Forge, a relatively new addition to the games, was completely removed in Halo 4 and replaced with Spartan Ops. This replacement could be justified if the two modes were remotely similar, but Spartan Ops was essentially just a stripped-down campaign with recycled maps from the multiplayer and the campaign, and the story that was told through Spartan Ops most people didn't keep up with. They were planning to have multiple seasons, but I'm pretty sure they stopped, barely even finished season 1. The point is, most players didn't care about it that much. Campaign and multiplayer were fairly standard, and nothing huge was added or removed. But the campaign didn't really try anything new as far as the gameplay side goes. Matchmaking was pretty much the same as it was in Reach, just a few tweaks to the way certain game modes worked. Like Invasion had pretty much been replaced by Dominion. Slayer was mostly Infinity Slayer, so you had kill streaks. But there wasn't a whole lot going on that was too different from Reach as far as gameplay goes. The campaign didn't expand the boundaries of a Halo campaign in any meaningful way, except for with the story, which I won't say anything bad about, except that it was very jarring when compared to other campaigns. Having this deep, personal human story about the Chief, who up to this point was always meant to be a shell for the player to inhabit, it's hard to go from this character has no personality aside from being badass to this is a real human character that is broken and has emotions. It kind of ruins the point of that character's intentional lack of development and almost retroactively makes the other stories worse. As a new player starting with Halo 4, if I went back and played the original games, I would be confused and probably agree with everyone who says Halo 4's story was the best, because it wasn't a bad story, but it didn't fit harmoniously with what was already there. Halo 4 had a lot of regression, and it wasn't necessarily the fault of the studio, as they were new and they seemed to lack a consistent direction, or maybe they didn't, but at the very least, look no further than the art style to see how concerned that vision was with remaining consistent to what came before. A lot of these issues were resolved with Halo 5. Forge got a great improvement and is widely considered to be the best version of Forge. I don't necessarily agree, but that's a video for another time. The custom game section was mostly fixed, and a lot of game modes and customization options that were missing in Halo 4 were returned, and then more. And I would say that the custom games of Halo 5 have thrived tremendously more than they ever did in Halo 4. And I would be remiss to leave out split screen, though. The longtime staple of the Halo franchise was completely absent in this game. And that was a huge blow to the series, and it did damage to the franchise as a whole. Warzone, the Firefight Spartan Ops replacement, as it were, has its own critiques, and they're pretty well known in this new age of anti-loot crates, but it does have its fans, and I think that it's a welcome addition and would be much more so if it wasn't a replacement. The campaign in Halo 5 is infamous at this point for having a poorly written and rushed story, so I see no reason to beat a dead horse here, though I will say I'm glad Halo 5's campaign had more experimentation in its level design and some of its gameplay encounters than Halo 4 did. I know it sounds like I'm just harping on 343's games, but I really want to drive home 2 points with this. The first one I really want you to remember, if nothing else, because I think it serves an important role in the future of Halo, and holding the developers accountable to it will help shape a better Halo game and build a greater community because of it. So please remember that Halo is an iterative game. Each game builds on the previous one. Things that worked on previous games should be kept and expanded upon, not replaced or dropped out. Honestly, I hope 343 has learned this lesson by now. The fact that they told us outright that split screen will be returning gives me hope, but that sort of attitude needs to be applied everywhere, not just where the fans complain. The second point is a little harder to swallow, and I know plenty of people will disagree, but I believe that it is equally as important as my first point. In fact, it's central to holding up that first point of Halo being about iteration. What I'm talking about is core gameplay, and its need to return to the Golden Triangle. You probably thought I was done talking about Halo 5, but there's one more thing I need to touch on because it's the biggest change that was made to differentiate Halo 5 from any other Halo game. In fact, it's a fairly unique change, and I don't think there's any FPS that has it in the same way. Enhanced mobility is a game changer. And if you don't know exactly what I'm referring to, it's the thrusters, the ground pound, the hover while you're aiming down sights. Those abilities that Halo 5 has integrated into the base gameplay mechanics, they change everything. In Halo 4, things were already different because you had sprint, so maps had to be stretched out and kind of set to adjust for that extra speed. But as far as everything else goes, Halo 4 doesn't really feel all that different from Halo again. It still feels like Halo, just with sprint. Halo 5 is a huge leap from Halo 4 in terms of gameplay, and they don't feel remotely similar. This change also serves to further complicate the maps and encounter design of the campaign and multiplayer. And let me be clear, I'm not saying that it's unfair or even a poor implementation. I think it's implemented really well. But if Halo 5 wasn't a Halo game, there'd be no issue here. The fact that it is a Halo game means that it has a lot of expectations that come with a Halo game, particularly being that it's a follow-up to what's considered a misstep in the franchise already. Now, I won't be presenting a huge list of arguments for why I think enhanced mobility should be excluded from Halo Infinite, because I know that there are some really good arguments out there for keeping it, and it is an excellent and unique addition that helps separate Halo from other FPSs, and it does feel intuitive once you get into it. The problem is when you try to apply it to the simplicity that Halo was founded on, it makes the whole game exponentially harder to plan and design for, and it makes it so much harder to approach. Now, you may be thinking, how does that make it harder to approach? I mean, you still got the same basic mechanics in there, but there's things built into the game that are designed to be there now that a lot of people won't be able to figure out very easily. It's almost like trying to fly a Cessna aircraft with the controls of a 747. You're still performing the same basic actions, but you have more buttons to press. You got more ways to perform the same actions. Sometimes things are better when they're left simpler. Halo is nice because there's a very simple base to learn, and it's fairly intuitive. It's what you'd expect. But once you learn that base, you can layer on more sandbox elements that adds depth to the game and can allow for far greater player expression because you know the ropes. Everything else just comes naturally. Limitations can be a great source of creativity as long as they're set correctly. Forge mode is a good example because it is often argued that Halo 5's Forge is a bit too complicated. And I think it gives people too much freedom. And a lot of people are overwhelmed by the more advanced control scheme and the amount of customization you're given. So a lot of people just decided not to play with it as much because it seems almost professional. And that's not a bad thing. I don't want to make it sound like I'm complaining about being given too good of a tool, but with the original Forge mode in Halo 3 and Halo Reach even, things were still kept simple enough that a new player could be thrown into Forge mode and at least figure out some of the basics, and someone who does Forge mode 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, can make a lot of really impressive and absolutely breathtaking maps. But it's still fun for both people. Halo 5, it feels like it's more only fun for the people who are willing to dedicate ridiculous amounts of time to it. To a lesser degree, it's just the same thing with the regular gameplay. If you give it too much depth, then those people who really dedicate themselves to it, they'll love it. But the general audience, the casuals, if you want to put it that way, they won't even try investing that much time into it because it'll be too overwhelming. Again, I'm not saying enhanced mobility or the Forge mode in Halo 5 are bad. I'm saying that they sort of ruin that approachability, that appeal that Halo has had in the past. And there's no way to please everybody. I know I'll have my own disappointments when Halo Infinite comes out, but I'm excited about what 343 has said about Halo Infinite. They've called it a spiritual reboot. Of course, this can mean a whole host of things, but I think that it's better to start with a clean slate now rather than dragging along this disconnected baggage that they've had over the last decade. And I hope this reboot we'll let them start from the basics and have something that will remain consistent through the games going forward. Heck, it might even be a good time for them to stop iterating through games and just have a single platform for a while. If Halo Infinite launches and it's the only Halo game that comes out for the next decade and they just treat it like a service, they update it periodically, add story, add new multiplayer options, new modes, as long as it's got a good base, I'm okay with that. As long as they can keep it fresh and keep the community engaged, there's nothing wrong with having a decade-long experience. And while that announcement excites me and it gets me optimistic for the future, I'm still uneasy. Thus far, I haven't been given a whole lot of reasons to put trust in these developers. Even the announcement of the MCC coming to Windows 10 and Steam, that's nice, but I'm still cautiously optimistic. If Halo Infinite is a repeat of what we've had the last two entries in the mainline Halo games, I don't think the franchise will ever recover. I already know that there's damage from Halo 5, but it's possible to move past that. I don't think that if Halo Infinite is a repeat of that level, I don't think it's going to come back. It does appear that they're taking steps to rectify what's gone wrong, but we don't know what will actually be in the game yet. We haven't seen gameplay. For all we know, this spiritual reboot could be code for resetting everything, not guaranteeing the inclusion of any prior game modes or portions of the game that used to be considered integral. What if Halo Infinite releases without Forge mode or without Theater mode? My worry is that they'll just use this reboot excuse to exclude things that would otherwise be pretty unacceptable. Justifying that some things needed to be cut in order to fit inside this new scope. I hope I'm wrong, and that Infinite can pick up the strings right where Reach left them. Include everything, add more, iterate. And perhaps they'll guide a course with renewed ambition that Reach lacked. They'll have passion for the project and want to continue it, and they'll lead Halo into a new golden age. If nothing else, might as well hope. I know I sound pessimistic, but wouldn't you be too? Aren't you a little pessimistic? Seeing the way everything else has gone so far, it's hard not to be. But there's optimism, there's hope, there's shreds of it all over the place. And each little bit of news I get a little bit more optimistic for this game. It's not like with Halo 5, where every bit of news we got just was kind of another nail for the coffin. You know, the exclusion of split screen and all that. The fact that their writers were dropping off the project. I haven't had that happen yet. And the game is a year and a half from release, so I know we can expect to get some bad news eventually. We've got plenty of time. But we haven't had it yet. And that gives me hope. Having heard what I've talked about, I'm curious what you think. Is there anything that I'm completely missing the point on? Is there anything that you can think of that I really need to reevaluate? Because I'm curious. I have these beliefs pretty close to my heart as far as Halo goes. But I want to know what you think too. So go ahead and leave your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section.